by introducing myself. I am a software developer from Arizona. I work at StepZen. I was formerly a teacher for several years before transitioning into digital marketing. And then, hey, fellow Arizonan, and then into tech. And so I see you, all you career changers. And I think it's really good to have different experience, and often people underestimate the value of their past professions when they're moving into tech. So if that's something you want to bring up with me in Coffee and Code, I'd be happy to chat about it, talk to you about how my digital marketing experience can kind of inform the job search there. But also, debugging is one of my favorite things to do too. So I've introduced myself. I'll turn it over to you, Anthony.
Hey, I already spoke a little bit about myself for the keynote, but my name is Anthony Campolo, and I also have a teaching background. Funny enough, that was something I didn't mention in my keynote. I'm a late career changer, and I was originally a music teacher, and I've changed some of my avatars, but a couple of them floating around still have the picture of me with the upright bass. And so yeah.
Fellow teachers in the house.
Yeah. So we're here to talk to you about the very, very basics of GraphQL, and I'm super excited because we get to really kind of go from ground zero here, and you have a really cool kind of metaphor that we use to describe this, and it's really useful, especially for people who are coming from the REST world, which, for me, when I went through my boot camp, like I didn't learn GraphQL in my boot camp at all. We did the normal kind of RESTful APIs. And for anyone who isn't kind of familiar with that, it's like get, post, put, those kind of things. And when you hit an endpoint and you want to do something at that endpoint, you want to either like get a bunch of stuff, or you want to write some stuff, or you want to update some stuff, CRUD, as someone says in the chat. So that's not quite the same thing that we do with GraphQL. So why don't you go ahead and kind of set us up for like how we like to think about this here.
Of course. And before that, I just wanted to mention, if Brian's workshop seems like a lot coming at you at once, it is two tools at once. It's StepZen and GraphQL. So in this one, we're taking a step back just to look at what GraphQL is, right? So if Brian's workshop seemed like a lot, then you can, after this workshop, go back and review the link to his video, and I think it'll become a lot clearer. But yeah, so there's a analogy that's used a lot to teach APIs, and it's that the client is kind of like a customer at a restaurant, and the server is kind of like the database, and the API is the waiter running back and forth. And normally, if you're like me, when you first learned REST APIs, whenever you say you send a request to the database, and it's like, okay, I need a burger and fries. And then a bunch of others say, if that request is a request for data, a bunch of other data comes back with it, like a turkey and a fruitcake, and you have to write all this filter logic to filter it all out. And GraphQL really blew my mind, because it's like, you don't have to do that. You just request what you want, and that's what you get. It just simplifies so much of the app building experience. So I'm really excited for you guys to learn about it today.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really like about GraphQL is that it's set up in a way where it's very easy to actually get started with if you have a GraphQL endpoint already. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and then I'm also going to share my screen and show people just a little bit of, someone needs to give me the ability to share my screen. I believe, yeah, that was my fault, because I had hopped off for a second, so I wasn't sure if we were going to a different room for this. All right, cool. So anyone can go to this endpoint here. So it's just rickandmortyapi.com/GraphQL. And this is fairly similar to what we were looking at with Brian. He also had this is what's called like a graphical editor or graphical playground, and it's a way to make GraphQL queries. And one of the things that's really cool about GraphQL is it's, there are a lot of similarities no matter what GraphQL tools you're using. And one thing that we're always going to have is these two things over here. We have our schema and we have our docs. And this lets you know kind of what is the GraphQL API that you want to query from. So we see here that we have these character types, and character has things like a name and gender and location. And if we look here at docs, this is actually how we can interact with our GraphQL API. So we want to do a query for characters, and we want to get a list of those characters back. So if we look here, we have this characters type, and it has results. And this is basically like an array. So if you've ever seen an array in JavaScript or another language, you have the brackets, and the character objects is this. And we can ask for whatever we want. So going back to that analogy of ordering exactly what we want, you don't have to order the whole character. Like if we just wanted the name of the character, we could do that. So how do we do that? First, we want to write a query. So we literally say first query. We tell GraphQL that we want to write a query. And then what we want to get out of this query, well, first let's give our query name. We're gonna call this query get characters. And then the actual query is going to be for the characters. And we need to say that we want the results. And this is just kind of like a quirk of this one specific GraphQL API. You don't necessarily need to create your schema in this way, but normally it would just be like characters name. And so that's just kind of like one weird quirk of the Rick and Morty API, but I still like using it just because it's really nice. But right now, if we were to run this query, then we're gonna get an error. That's interesting. Nothing's happening. Huh. Okay. Let's try.
Hey, Anthony __ GraphQL. If that's where. Oh, this you're not. Okay.
Okay. I think it. Okay. For some reason, it was not handling the errors correctly. I'm not sure what's the deal with that. I was trying to get it to give me an error, but this is the correct thing that will actually give you back the answer. So we do a query, and it was get characters query, and we want, let's say, in addition to the name, we also want the status. So now we can see that this, whatever we're going to write on the left, is going to be what we're going to get back. So let's see, what other stuff could we get here? So we could also get the species. So if we add species here, then we now get the species. So this is what's really cool about GraphQL, is that you have the ability to just query it and get exactly the data you want back. And right now, this is totally decoupled from any sort of like library or JavaScript tool. Like right now, there really is no front end whatsoever. And so it's a common thing that people think of GraphQL as being really tightly coupled to something like a React, but that's really not the case. It's entirely its own thing. It's actually a specification that is handled by a whole foundation. But if you're kind of curious about all that, I definitely recommend kind of looking into like the history of GraphQL. I think it's a really interesting project. But another thing that I wanted to show here is that we don't need to use this graphical editor. We can just make an API request directly to this endpoint. And this should actually give me the error message I was hoping to get earlier. So this is Insomnia. And Insomnia is a lot like Postman. It's a cool tool for just interacting with APIs however you want. So right now we are going to make a post request to this same endpoint that we were doing before. And right now we're gonna get an error back because to do GraphQL, you have to send a query. So we haven't sent a query or anything at all. So it should give us an error back. And not only is it giving us an error back, it knew that we were trying to make a post. So it's giving us a specific error back saying post body missing. Did you forget to use body parser middleware? If you've ever built out like a backend with Node or Express or anything like that, you may have brought in a body parser library, and there is a GraphQL query setting in Insomnia. Insomnia has a lot of really nice GraphQL integrations already built in. And so if we do this, we're still not going to send a query, but we're going to do that. And now it's giving us a different error. Now it knows that we have tried to send a string, but doesn't have a string. So it's saying it must provide query string. And so if we try to make a query, then it's going to give us an error saying that you haven't actually, made a query. And before, this is what I was trying to get the graphical editor to error out with. Now it's giving us, it says actually what you need. So it's letting us know that we actually have to give it more information. And so then if we give it actually the query that we want, then we can still get the data back just like we were previously. Cool. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a quick second. Are there any questions so far for what we've gone over?
We have a couple. There's one interesting question which maybe you can elaborate on is Drew asked, where's the post specified? Do you want to talk about how GraphQL architects its REST endpoints?
Yeah. So as we were talking about with kind of CRUD and REST, you have things like get, post, put, and patch. So these different like HTTP verbs. And that's what is different about GraphQL, because you just have a single endpoint with GraphQL. So instead of having different endpoints that you send different verbs to, you have a single endpoint that you send everything to, and you just send generic queries and specify in the query what you want to do with it. So everything is going to be a post, but it's not there. A post isn't always going to create something or write something like you normally would think of for a post. And when I was showing how I was writing the query and I wrote the word query, if you want to actually write to a database or update something in a database, you would write mutation. So you have queries and you have mutations. So there's a decent amount of kind of terminology that goes along with this, but you don't really have to worry about the HTTP verbs anymore. You don't have to worry about get, post, put, and patch or any of that stuff, because you are always going to specify whatever the kind of equivalent HTTP verb is going to be specified within the query itself that you're sending.
Right. And then Sergio asked if this example uses StepSend or just the GraphQL Playground. We're just using the GraphQL Playground. If you need to review how to integrate StepSend, you can go back to Brian's talk. And then Panos, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, does your example just now use would Altair GraphQL client work the same as Insomnia? Are you familiar with Altair, Anthony?
I actually don't think I've ever heard of.
Okay, I just Googled it. And I don't know if it would be the same as Insomnia, because it looks like, I mean, unless your meaning is this a way to look at requests more easily, in which case like Insomnia is after REST.
I can pitch in. They're very similar. They're very, very similar. You can use one or the other. I'm not sure what the advantages are of one over the other, but cool. They're definitely similar.
Okay, so there's a good question about how this relates to the MERN stack. So the MERN stack is Mongo, Express, React, and Node, and GraphQL can be integrated as essentially a middle layer there. So if you wanted to essentially take your Mongo and Express backend and expose that as a GraphQL endpoint to your React front end. That is how you would integrate GraphQL into the mix. Now, this is a really interesting question, because if you've already got that stack set up, then there's not really a whole ton of benefit in like introducing GraphQL into the mix, unless you want to bring in all this like kind of GraphQL tooling that comes along with it. It's more so if you were to think about the type of project that you built that MERN stack with, and you're going to like do a greenfield version of that. If you were to think about building that from the ground up with GraphQL, that's how you get your backend and your front end like all really, really super duper nicely integrated in a way that they can speak to each other super well. So it's kind of a question of like, what is the benefit you're going to get from introducing GraphQL? And do you already have a full stack that like has a kind of coherent way of speaking to each other? Because part of what is really nice about something like a Mongo is that it's very much like document kind of thing where you're kind of like throwing JSON at it. So a lot of what GraphQL is doing is kind of meant to model some of the experience you get from working with like a MERN stack. But it's like they're philosophically very much aligned in terms of like what they're kind of going for and the type of development experience you get from working with it. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much for answering that. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, and just to kind of also clarify, when someone was asking about the like where the post was, so right now this is just using Insomnia's basically like graphical editor to say what we're sending in terms of like get, post, put, or patch. What we're going to go on to next is actually how to make a fetch request and actually specify like what is a post request and what is not. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into that in a second. But if there's no more major questions right now, I think we can move on to the next thing. Looks like there's still a couple more. Is there a design architecture? If you kind of specify a little bit what you mean by design architecture. Oh, so some like, yeah, so you could, so they ask if you could use like MVC with GraphQL. Definitely. So if you think of MVC as model view controller, your model and your views would talk to each other with GraphQL, and your controller is like the resolvers in GraphQL. So, worry too much about what a resolver is, but the point is that you can think of MVC and GraphQL, you can think of them fitting together fairly well if you just think of your view and your model as your front end and your back end talking to each other, and then the thing in the middle being the controller. So that's kind of like the GraphQL type equivalent. So all these things fit in really nicely well together, because it's mostly just like a universal way for front end and your back end to talk to each other. So if you think of like MVC or your MERN stack or any of this kind of stuff, it's all about just connecting front ends to back ends, like front end to back end to front. It's all about that. And that's really the crux of like what GraphQL is doing. All right, so.
One more question from MSAD says, what is the minimal pre-knowledge needed to get into it? So
hopefully what we're doing right now.
Yeah, that's our goal is to be available to all starting points.
Yeah, and there's actually one other thing that I realized we still didn't really go over was, let me share my screen again. So this is the GraphQL homepage, and I really recommend people check this out. Like if you don't end up on this site at least one time in the next week, then you've probably missed something, because this is like the kind of best home-based resource for general GraphQL. If you just want to understand what is GraphQL terminology and all that kind of stuff, this is a really good place to go. And what it does on the homepage is it walks you through like a very, very simple hello world example, where you first define your type. So our type is going to be a project, and our project is going to have a name, a tagline, and it's going to have a bunch of contributors. So this is much like when we were on the Rick and Morty endpoint, we had a character type, and that character had a name, it had a status, and it had a list of episodes it was on. This is the same idea. So this is how you're defining your schema. So it's a schema definition language. So that's another GraphQL-ism. And then this is your actual query, which we were showing in the GraphQL editor, and in Insomnia, you could write the word query in front here, or you can leave it off and it infers that it's a query. And if we see here, this is a little different from the query we ran. The query we ran was just like, it would have been projects instead of project. And we got a list back. Whereas with this, they're actually asking for a specific project, and they are providing an input for what project they want, and they're providing the name of that project, which is GraphQL. So you can actually provide arguments to your queries as well. And then they want specifically the tagline for that project. So this is the query, and then this is the results. The result you get back is you get the tagline for the project being GraphQL, and the tagline being a query language for APIs. So this is like very, very simple kind of hello world. And then you can check out the actual docs, and they're very well written, and they really walk you through kind of step by step. So this being another example of a very simple query saying that I want to get me, and I want my name, and my name is of course Luke Skywalker. Cool. Let's see, any other questions that came in?
Yeah, I like Claude's. Is there a difference between vanilla GraphQL, quote unquote, and how we'll be using it over the next few days?
Yeah, you want to take that one?
I would say it's a good question for me to think about. I would say kind of yes and no. We take a lot of the work of writing some of these things out for you, and yet you'll still be writing GraphQL files to deploy to a steps and endpoint.
Yeah, I would say that there's going to be kind of a mix of vanilla GraphQL and then some kind of steps and isms, and Brian alluded to that just a little bit in his presentation. And the way you can think about it is that anything you're going to be doing on the front end to actually make the GraphQL queries, that's what's going to be generic to any way of working with GraphQL. And then the stuff that's the actual API that you're creating, like anytime you're using like the StepZen CLI or anything like that, those are the things that are specific to StepZen. But even still, within the stuff you're doing that's specific to StepZen, it all still follows the GraphQL spec in terms of like how you define your types and that kind of thing. So there's still pretty much that's the cool thing is that like vanilla GraphQL is there's not really that much of a difference between how people implement it and how it's like specified, because you got to actually follow the spec fairly closely to make it work at all. Cool. So I've got a question about Apollo. So what role does Apollo play in GraphQL? This gets at like the kind of history of GraphQL, and it's actually quite interesting because there was a project called Meteor, and Meteor was an attempt to make a full stack JavaScript framework that was like fully integrated and really nice, much like you would think of maybe Redwood.js today. And the team behind Meteor ended up having to pivot because they got a lot of VC dollars and eventually kind of ran out of runway, and that's how these things go. And then they got into GraphQL essentially and turned into Apollo. So Apollo is basically an outgrowth of Meteor, and they saw where the real value they could add in Meteor was this kind of mediating layer between the front end and the back end. And they essentially had a head start in thinking about a lot of these problems and how you can sync the front end and the back end. And so you ended up with this team Apollo that built a lot of open source libraries like Apollo Server and Apollo Client. And so you've got a wide kind of suite of open source tools that are all under the banner of Apollo. And then Apollo itself is then a company that also sells services that go along with those products. So when you look at kind of GraphQL examples online, it's pretty common to see like the Apollo server used for the server backend and the Apollo client for the client front end. And in fact, Redwood.js is made up of Apollo server and Apollo client, although this is kind of starting to shift a little bit because you can swap out different pieces, but it's a huge rabbit hole that we don't need to necessarily go down. So the important takeaway here is just that Apollo is a very prominent part of the GraphQL ecosystem that has numerous tools that many people use, but that you don't need to necessarily use Apollo to do anything in GraphQL. Like anything that you can do with these different Apollo tools, there are other equivalents for it from other libraries, other companies, or you can just build up the stuff yourself. This is the thing that at any point in time, you could just make your own client. You could write all of this stuff entirely from scratch if you want. You don't ever have to use any of these open source tools that exist for GraphQL. It's just about what tools are out there, how can you leverage them, and how they all fit in. So this is why it's like it takes a lot of wrap your mind around all this stuff and all these different things, how they all relate to each other. But this is why we're not going to teach you Apollo in this intro workshop, because like we're going to kind of build up from an even more base layer than that.
Right. And then we got a lot of messages coming in, which is awesome. But I want to miss Daniel On's question up at the top. It says, when describing the data, quote unquote, this is different from the actual model schema. Daniel, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So
I think he's asking, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, yeah, because on the GraphQL website, you have a type project, name string, tagline string, so on and so forth. But in one of my MERN projects, we have like a similar style of a schema for our backend models. So I don't know if that's supposed to replace that or if that's two separate entities.
Yeah, so it's going to depend on your database really, because you're going to usually define your database models and then you're going to have a schema that's going to interact with it. So for example, in like Redwood, you have a Prisma schema, and then that's what actually does the database migrations. And then you have a schema that's kind of separate from that. And so that's going to kind of depend on like what your backend actually is. And this is what StepZen is going to handle for you. If you want to connect to a MySQL database or something like that, you're able to just create that StepZen schema. And then that's kind of like the thing that mediates all of that.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to highlight and review something we've got going on in the chat. It's a good distinction. So GraphQL is different from SQL in that SQL is a query language for databases and GraphQL is a query language for APIs.
Yeah. And so that's why you can put an API layer on top of your database. And this is actually good segue to the questions right now about FaunaDB. So I've actually built some projects with FaunaDB, and FaunaDB it's pretty interesting. It's pretty much custom database that has its own query language entirely called FQL, the Fauna query language, which is like a functional Lisp kind of language, and it has a very steep learning curve. So they also have a GraphQL endpoint that lets you interact with FaunaDB through just their GraphQL API. So it's kind of like how with StepZen, you can create these APIs that can connect to all these different backends, whereas Fauna is saying we have our one canonical database that is Fauna, and then we built this GraphQL API and stuck it on front for anyone who wants to use it. So you can kind of think of what you're doing with StepZen is like creating your own GraphQL endpoint to whatever your backend is, whereas a lot of these like more well-known services that already have these built out backend, they already created that GraphQL API for you. So that's one of the things that's really cool about getting your hands on something like StepZen is you get to go beyond just these GraphQL endpoints that are being handed to you. Like what we're doing right now is we're just kind of like showing you in this example, it's like the Rick and Morty APIs. Like this is an API that's already built for you, but you can actually build your own APIs in this challenge. Alrighty, cool. That was a lot of good questions, guys. Thank you. I think we are at the point where we can move on to the fetch stuff. Okay, I am going to drop a link in the chat. So this is a little repo that I've put together for you all. And there's a couple things going on in this repo. And it's meant to show a couple different ways that you can make GraphQL requests. So what we've shown so far is we showed how to do it just by going to the actual Rick and Morty endpoint or by hitting it with something, a tool like Insomnia. But there's going to be a couple other things you can do that are going to help you kind of actually bring it into a project. So there's a little explanation here of the stuff that we already have kind of gone over, which is like, what is your schema? What are the types and how do you actually like query it? And then this is also kind of what we already went over, how to query the endpoint. And if you want to actually like get your hands on how to do this in a project, you can clone this repo. So let's go ahead and get this going. And then
there's a double git clone.
Oops. It's funny, no matter what, Git is always where the margin of error comes into play every single time. So this is just going to be a simple little project that has a index.js and an index.html. So there's like no dependencies whatsoever in this project. And if anyone has ever just used like the fetch API, then this should be fairly simple. What we have here is we just have a boilerplate HTML file, and we're importing a script tag here. And the only thing we're going to need to actually like run this is there's a nice little extension called Live Server, which I recommend people check out. It's just lets you kind of kick off a little development server so you can see what your project is doing. And the way we do that is you can either click Go Live here, or you can right click and say Open with Live Server. And so right here, we're on localhost 5500/public/index.html. If you just went to this port, and you can kind of see these files here, and we want to be here. And then if we open up our console over here, right now we're getting this hello Mintbean right here. And that's because we are seeing hello Mintbean there. Now, what we want to do though, is we want to make a fetch request to that Rick and Morty GraphQL API that we were seeing before. And the fetch API is something that's just built into the browser and that anyone can use. And the way you do it is you literally just write the word fetch, and then you've put in the endpoint that you want to query. So right now we have this endpoint, which is rickandmortyapi.com/GraphQL. And then inside of these curly brackets here, we need to tell it what kind of request we want to make. And so this is where we're going to actually say post. So this was like when we were doing the query through Insomnia, we selected post, and that's how we're letting it know that it's post. And then we're also going to send in some headers. And so headers is where you would do something like authentication, which is something that you'll likely come across. And it says my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully you all still hear me. And we're going to tell it that the content type is going to be JSON. And this is also if we wanted to do like authorization, then we could put in an authorization header and then do something like bearer and then concatenate on the string. So that's the type of thing that you would do if you need to also send keys over to the endpoint, but you wouldn't want to do that in just like your client side JavaScript thing here. You'd want to do it like a serverless function, but that's kind of outside the scope of this little intro here. So we've already got the method and the headers, and then we've got this right here, which is going to be the actual body. And so what I was saying before about how what's really nice about GraphQL is that you just have this like kind of query string that you're throwing over the wire. So we're sending a payload, this body payload, and then we're just taking this same query that we were already sending before, and we're stringifying it and just making the request. And then once we've done that, we then do these .thens, and this is because it's a promise and we need to resolve the promise. And then we're going to get the data and then console log the data, and then it's going to have a little data thing on it. So that's why it's data.data, but I'll explain that in a second. So if we save that, then now over here, we see that we're actually getting the whole thing here, getting characters, and we're getting results, and then we get the list of things over here. And if we take that off, just kind of show what I was talking about here. Now it says data, right? And the reason, this is just kind of like a kind of quirk of GraphQL, is that you make the request and you send that string that has the whole thing, and then it gives you back the exact thing. And so sometimes it gives it back to you like wrapped in some sort of object. That object may be named data, but we can then kind of pull that out like that, and then we can go even further if we want to say, okay, I don't want to just get that data object, I want to drill down a little more. You can then say dot characters like that, and then now you see we're just getting this results thing, and then we can drill down a level deeper and say results, and then now we're actually just getting the array of the thing. And so this is important to know, because if you want to go a step further beyond this, what I'm showing you right now, you would want to say you want to actually take this object and then map over it and then display it in the DOM. So you could do, document dot get element by ID, and then do inner HTML and just write it directly onto the page. And you need to kind of know what the shape of the data is that you're getting, so you can destructure it out and kind of map over it. And if that's something people want to know more about after this, feel free to message me. We can kind of go deeper into that. But I just wanted to kind of show how to do the actual query itself, and without any kind of libraries, without bringing any dependencies. If we have more time, we can go a step further than this and show how to do this with an actual GraphQL client. But let's break right there and take questions. And Lucia, feel free to jump in at all if you wanted to add anything on that.
That looks awesome.
There was one question which I just wanted to bring attention to, because I know a lot of people are thinking this. Drew asked, Drew asked a question about how you would connect GraphQL into a React state. So could you maybe wax poetic a little bit about how to take your GraphQL data and put it into a state array, maybe inside a React functional component? Could you maybe explain how you would do that?
Yeah, and that's actually, so that's the next thing that I can kind of show, which will probably help with that, is so what I just showed is there was no library, right? There was no dependencies, there's no package.json, like there was no React at all. So this is what you call vanilla JavaScript. So someone was asking about, vanilla GraphQL before, like this is just fetch is vanilla JavaScript. And some people are asking about like Axios and things like that. Axios is a library that wraps fetch. So when you're using Axios, you are making fetch requests, and it's giving you kind of a nice wrapper to do that for you. So you could put like headers on and do that kind of thing. So this is the most basic way you can make a GraphQL request without any libraries. But this doesn't really get you anywhere. Like this is a learning exercise. This isn't really the way you would ever want to actually do this. And some people are very adamant about wanting to like do all their projects with vanilla JavaScript and do everything with the fetch API if they can. And I don't think that really gets you super far, honestly. And once you get into these kind of more real world projects, like the niceties you get from frameworks and libraries and people who've thought out these edge cases and actual real world use cases, they become very, very, very useful. And so this is why what you're really going to want to do is you're going to want to have some sort of front end framework to handle the taking that request, that data, and actually displaying it on the page. So now let's get into how you would actually do that, because it can be very theoretical if you try to just like talk about it. And what I've also done here is I've actually created a couple different branches here to show you what's going on. So I kicked it off just with the blank one that is only console logging hello Mintbean to make sure your dev environment's set up. But if you want to just jump ahead to the end, you can go to the fetch branch, and this then has that fetch request that I just made. But there's going to be another super secret branch here, if you also are so inclined to check out, where it shows how to actually connect a GraphQL request library. So GraphQL request is the kind of next step beyond the fetch API. So this is another one of those open source libraries that's from a pretty prominent GraphQL company. In this case, it's Prisma, although Prisma is kind of more general database tool now, although they still have strong lineage in the GraphQL community. And so they maintain this library. And as it says, it's a minimal GraphQL client supporting Node and browsers for scripts or simple apps. So this is not going to be as complex of a client as something like Apollo client. So I kind of think of it as like a midpoint between your like just basic fetch and then kind of more complex Apollo client. But with this, you are going to bring in a couple more libraries here. And so you are going to first use you can use yarn or npm. Either of these will get the trick done. And then you're going to actually install a couple dependencies here. So this is why I like showing the fetch API example first, because you don't need to bring in these kind of extra libraries. But if you want to actually have, a state management, do all that kind of stuff, then you can bring in React DOM, React scripts, and then GraphQL and GraphQL request. So some of these depend on other ones. That's why you'll need all 5 of these to do what I'm going to show you. But that's pretty much like the minimum viable GraphQL of what you need to do. And then you have some scripts, and you can just do like a create React app also if you don't want to kind of do this. This is basically just me kind of taking like the very base pieces of what you get from a create React app, and then just doing that. And so once you got all that going, then this is pretty much exactly the same as what we were looking at before. And then here, this is now we're making the request with the GraphQL request library. And for this, you would basically do the exact same thing, except we're using this thing right here. So we're importing GQL. And this is what lets us not have to do the JSON.stringify kind of thing. This is handling the query string part specifically. So that's why we have our query is inside of this kind of GQL thing. And then we set it to a variable that's in all caps with underscores. It's get characters query. And then we pass that query into this GraphQL client.request, and the client is being declared up here with the endpoint. So it's the kind of pieces you want to think about with this is that you've got there's always going to be the endpoint, and then there's going to be the query. And what you really just kind of have to figure out with the client is how do you actually get the client to understand what the endpoint is, and then how you send queries with the client. So that's basically what's happening here. And then we're going to console.log the data object. So the data object is what we're setting to the request. So this is doing the exact same thing that the fetch request did, and it's just doing it with GraphQL request instead. And so now, since we are in React world, we have these React scripts. So we can just do yarn start to start our development server. And then that's going to open that up on localhost 3000. And then over here, we see that we're getting our characters with the results. So this is now, you're at a point where you're basically set up to actually do what you would need to do to get this onto the home page. So what you would do from here is you would do something like a use state. So you would import use state from React, and then you could set the data object to the state. And you would also can then have things like, if you wanted to use context, you could use context, but you wouldn't necessarily need to go out all the way to that level. But this is kind of the next layer of like, once you've actually started making the request, like how do you actually like set it into the project. So does that kind of make sense in terms of like how conceptually you would like get at that?
Thanks, Anthony. Makes a lot of sense. I got at least one private message. Is it normal that a recent bootcamp grad, and this is private, so I'm not going to say their name, Monarch, is it normal that a recent bootcamp grad is only grasping 40 to 60% of the info being presented? And a few minutes ago, I had an overwhelming feeling of, oh crap, I may not be ready to start this journey, and I wanted to address that. I'll address it first, and I welcome any comments from Lucia and Anthony. I, as a senior developer, only ever grasp 40 to 60% of any info being presented until I get my hands dirty. So
yeah, you're doing great.
I can't think of anything that I learned just by watching, which is why tutorial hell is called tutorial hell and not tutorial heaven, because just watching tutorials, even from experts, only gets you so far. So if you're grasping 40 to 60%, I think it's great. And then coupled with the mentorship that the StepSend team is going to be presenting for the whole hackathon, including coffee and code hours, which you guys should really come to. I think you guys are fine. Lucia, would you agree?
Absolutely, 100%. Like there's part of this that you only get if you just start getting your hands on it, and we'll be available to take any questions. I'm very willing to answer any questions that you have. You might have this perception in your head that some question is like too simple to ask, and I don't consider any question to be that way. I wrote my first line of code like 4 years after I graduated college. So I have been, at like, I don't understand how to put an HTML page up in my browser, like sooner than you might think. So please don't worry about just getting in there and asking questions.
Yeah, really, like if there's a lot of information that didn't make sense, part of why this is challenging is that you all are coming at this from many different levels. So there were questions coming in that were people who are a little more experienced, and that's kind of who I was trying to speak to. So there were things I was saying that I would not expect you to understand. So that is a good thing if you don't. There are things that you didn't quite understand, because if you're like, oh, this all makes perfect sense, like you probably didn't actually understand all of it. So you should feel confused by some of it, and that's why we're trying to really emphasize here what is the stuff you really need to know. And that's why we want to really break it down to the very, very basics of like, what is an endpoint and what is a query. And if you can just wrap your mind around that, then you can start to worry about all the complexities around that, like after the fact. Like, I just want to give you an ability to like actually get your hands on it. So like, just go to the Rick and Morty endpoint and try and make a query, try and get some data back. If you can't do that, then that's great. That means you know where you need to ask help for. You say, like, I don't know how to make a query. And I say, like, great, we can show you how to make a query, So it's about knowing just enough to know how to ask the right questions. That's what we're trying to arm you with that knowledge right now. And so you should have a lot of questions. You should be looking at that like, okay, like I think I kind of get it, but what about this? What about this? What about this? And people are asking about all these what about thises, in the chat. And that's the great thing about this hackathon, though, is that, you don't have to get to all of those what about thises, because we're here to learn. We're here to have fun. We're here to make some cool stuff. So if everything doesn't make perfect sense, like that's okay, because like we're here to learn. Like if you already knew all this, then like why are you here?
Right. Yeah.
Totally. I think if I were to put it on a scale, if you're everything that was just covered, if you're a fresh bootcamp grad or a university grad or a college grad or self-taught and you don't have work experience, you should be grasping maybe 30%, 20 to 30% of what was said. So 50 to 60% is actually great. If you're new, you should be at this point grasping only 20 to 30%. If you have 1 year of experience, you should be grasping about 40 to 60%. If you have 3 years of experience, it should be about 80%. And if you have like tons and tons of experience, maybe you got all of it. But if you're in the beginning of your learning curve, even if you got like a fourth of everything that was said, that's enough for you to, it's a seed crystal. It's the root, it's a seed in your head that's going to grow if you feed it. And that's how learning works, is when you learn stuff, knowledge is arranged in a graph. And even if you get just little pieces of it, the more energy you put into learning, the more that graph grows just organically. So talk to Lucia and Anthony on the Steppers channel, ask them questions. There was another question, which was, is there a place where we can ask questions inside the Mintbean Discord? And yes, there is. There is a room. It's called Coding Questions. You can ask over there. You can ask in the Steppers room. We've organized them in different channels, but there are no real hard and fast rules about what channel to use. So just, if you don't know where to ask a question, ask it anywhere. Ask it in general. And somebody may tell you, hey, go over there and ask that question over there, or they'll answer you right there. It's a warm, friendly community. Cost of asking a question that you might think is dumb is 0. And chances are, if you're thinking that question, 100 other people are thinking it too. So please ask questions. Definitely take advantage of the very generous mentorship that StepSend is providing. You can talk to Lucia and Anthony directly in any of the channels, but definitely the Steppers channel and the current events channel would be great.
And just to quickly answer a couple more things that I'm not sure if we covered yet. I know a couple people were asking questions about like API keys and how to manage that, which I briefly alluded to. We have an article that was actually written by one of our colleagues, Carlos, about kind of how you'd want to approach that. And this is also something that we talk a little bit about with using Redwood.js and their kind of like built-in serverless GraphQL API type thing. So if you want to know more about that, feel free to check out this blog article that I just put in the chat, or message me directly, because that is kind of a nuanced question that's we don't have time to kind of like get into right now, but is kind of important in terms of like how you manage your keys. Basically, the main thing is you don't want your keys in your client, so you don't want to actually put your keys in the request you're making from like GraphQL request or from Apollo or something like that. So we can go into that more in the chats and whatnot, but that's definitely something to keep in mind and to ask about if you need help with. And then someone just asked, when getting started with a small project, would HTML, CSS, and GraphQL be enough? So you need to have some sort of JavaScript to actually like do the GraphQL request itself. So that would be the only other thing you need. And that was kind of what I first showed, is you just had HTML and JavaScript. There wasn't really any CSS. And then when I brought in GraphQL requests, that's where you had actually like dependencies, and you had to bring in some npm libraries. So it's really up to you how you want to do it. GraphQL is super flexible, and actually technically, I guess you really could do it without JavaScript. There's other ways to do it with other languages, but we're probably going to be mostly doing JavaScript here at this hackathon, because that's what I think most people are going to know, and that's where most of the resources for GraphQL are going to be based around JavaScript. So
if you need JavaScript help, hit us up in the questions. Forgot the name of it. the Discord. There you go. Yeah.
Marie says she'll be using C#.
Awesome.
Cool. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Feel free to message us or contact us if you need anything. I'll be
Come to the
around all
coffee
week.
and code hours. That'll be fun. Excited for that.
Awesome. I think we want to, is Brian coming back on for the...
Looks like he's getting in the zone, yeah. He just put his headphones on.
It's been a long session. I know you guys have been great at answering a lot of these questions, so really appreciate it.
All right, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
For whatever reason, if I take my headphones off, Zoom likes to force me to manually change the settings. Okay, so hopefully, I know we've thrown a lot of things at you really quickly. Hopefully you feel a little bit of comfort with the concepts around GraphQL. I know there's been a lot of talk about like not necessarily knowing everything that you need to know to get going. And don't worry, that's the whole point. I think we're just trying to give you enough to get you started to know where to look. So don't feel like you should in an hour have learned GraphQL. I've spent a lot of times doing all of this. So and I would say I'm not even necessarily, I wouldn't consider myself an expert. So it takes some time, but I think hopefully we've given you enough to get started on building the project. So I'm here to I already kind of showed you how to do that in steps, and I'm here to kind of just answer anybody's questions in terms of how they can get started doing this in StepSen at this point. If anybody in the chat wants me to review that whole piece again, I know it's been a long session, or I can just answer any questions on that if anybody has any immediate questions about it. Also within I shared on this chat, but it can be hard to follow within the Discord. I'm posting a handful of little tutorials, but I highly recommend checking out our blog. Obviously there's the documentation, but the blog also has a ton of tutorials that aren't specifically, and Joshua, yes, I'll share, I can share my slides. So it has a ton of tutorials that aren't specifically like StepSen only kind of things. Like I have one about consuming GraphQL APIs in plain JavaScript. I have one showing how to use GraphQL requests, how to use Apollo client, how to use, I can't remember what the other, Urkel, which are different libraries for consuming. Because you have to think about, there's two different pieces to this. One is I'm building my API, and that's really the only part that StepSen plays a part. You're writing GraphQL, you're writing schema definition language with some GraphQL specific, StepSen specific directives. But other than that, it's all just writing GraphQL types and things like that, and then figuring out what APIs you want to connect to. And then the other half of it, and some of what Anthony and Lucia covered, is how do I consume these APIs, which is like, how do I bring that into my front end? And so that involves both writing GraphQL queries to get the data you need. And that also involves on some level, doing the post to get the data, and then using that data, consuming that data within front-end application in JavaScript. So I know that those are, if you're kind of like, oh, I didn't catch everything, that's because those are a lot of different pieces. We took you all the way from the back to the front, in terms of building an application in a matter of a couple hours. So, yeah, let's see, I'm going to look for any questions. So the Discord link was shared. Okay, so the blogs I'm going to post there. All the blog posts are here, but I'm posting some on the Discord. I was just in the middle of doing that when my time came up here. That to 3 in particular that will be helpful for you, I think, getting started, which covers some of what Lucia and Anthony covered as well. And then, but but the blog in general has a ton of different things. So like, so if you want to say, oh, I just want to learn how to write my first steps in backend, it's got a tutorial for that. Obviously the docs too, but there's a lot of resources there that I think will be helpful to you.
Absolutely. And I think that we're coming back to the first coffee and code hour as well. We're going to be planning on, sorry, I feel like there seems to be an echo on my end. Does anyone else hear it?
Nope.
No?
You're good. Yep.
Never mind. Yeah, there's a lot to consume here with all the resources and everything that we've absorbed. So we can go about it two ways. We can kind of stay on the call, and if you guys have more questions, we can go through those questions, or we can come back at 4 when in the coffee and code hour, when we start planning on how to plan your project. Thoughts? If you want to open up your mics or in the chat.
Also, I just posted a few more links in the Discord channel with some specific posts on the blog that I think could be helpful to people. You know, I know it can be hard sometimes going back through video, like, oh, okay, where exactly was that thing that we talked about? So, and I'm always somebody who likes to learn by reading, but.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone learns differently as well. Some people prefer the video format. Some people prefer written. Okay, I would like to come back for the coffee and code. Okay, cool. I think everyone could probably use a little bit of a break as well. We've been on this call for a while, so let's take a break. Let's come back at 4 and then get started with, and it'll give you guys a chance to actually look at the different Kanban tickets as well. And really absorb the hack. Sounds good?
Somebody was asking which Zoom link do you come back to? Is it this one or is it a new link?
It's a new link, so we'll drop it in the current. That's a great question. I should have clarified. So we'll be dropping it in the current event channel, and we'll also drop it in the Stepper channel as well.
Elvira, it's Eastern time. It's 4 p.m. Eastern time. Yeah.
Yes. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciated everyone joining the call. And thank you so much to the entire StepsN team. Fantastic content and super resourceful.
Yay.
Awesome. I think Monarch had to jump off, but thank you so much, guys.
Thank you,
really
everyone.
appreciate it. Take care. Bye.
It was our
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Bye.
Happy hacking.
See you.
Bye.